A life-or-death decision is expected today in the high-profile case of Georgia death row prisoner Troy Anthony Davis. His execution is scheduled for 7 p.m. Wednesday. After a day-long hearing on Monday from supporters and detractors, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles announced it'll take more time to consider whether to grant Davis clemency. The board allowed his execution to proceed in 2008 before it was put on hold by the Georgia Court of Appeals. Since then, 3 new members have joined. The board has the sole authority to stay the execution under Georgia law. Davis was convicted of the 1989 killing of an off-duty white police officer. Since then, 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses have recanted their testimony, and there's no physical evidence tying Davis to the crime scene. Amnesty International, the NAACP, and numerous other groups have called for clemency. Former FBI Director William Sessions is among those calling for a closer examination of whether Davis is guilty, joining a list that includes the Pope, former President Jimmy Carter, and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Supporters of Davis have been holding an around-the-clock vigil outside the Atlanta building where the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles is convening. Protests are also taking place across the United States and around the world. On Twitter, Davis's supporters have shared news about the case using the hashtag #TooMuchDoubt. The family of Officer Mark McPhail, meanwhile, has campaigned for the execution to go ahead as scheduled. On Monday, McPhail family members joined prosecutors in arguing their case before the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles. With the board's decision coming today, I'm joined now by 2 guests here in New York. Reverend Jesse Jackson, civil rights leader, founder of the Rainbow Push Coalition, a vocal supporter of the campaign to spare Davis's life. He met with him just a few months ago, as well as a member of the Pardons Board in June. And joining me from Washington, D.C., Mary Schmidt-Mergler, Senior Counsel for the Constitution Project's Criminal Justice Program. She's assembled statements from a former Georgia Supreme Court justice, congressmen, and prosecutors, as well as a former Texas governor who urged the Supreme Court and now the Georgia Pardons Board to halt Davis's execution and commute his death sentence to life in prison. Reverend Jackson, let's begin with you. Why are you calling for Troy Davis's life to be spared?
Because there's not only reasonable, but there's substantial doubt. No physical evidence that he did the killing. The family is in great pain, the policeman who was killed, but he should not be used as a trophy to give them false relief. Of those who testified against him, 9 have recanted their position, suggesting that they were either under pressure or didn't have adequate information. With this much abounding doubt, his life should be spared. We'll not be safer Wednesday morning if he's killed the night before.
It's interesting. 7 of the 9 recanted. One of the 2 who didn't is the person that others point the finger at, Red Coles, who's the one that went to the police department that night and said it was Troy Davis who did the shooting.
That further makes the case more compelling, because the suggestion of the one who went that night is, in fact, the chief suspect. But in this environment where a kind of bloodthirst is emerging here, where Rick Perry says he presides over 232 executions and gets a standing applause, there's something toxic in the wind. In many ways, America's character is on trial in this case. And I would hope that the family would know that we who plead for the life of Troy Davis is not insensitive to the loss of their loved one, but they should not accept him as a trophy and then have some sense of false relief.
Mary Schmidt-Mergler, you have been putting together a list of high-profile supporters calling for Davis's life to be spared. Talk about some of these people. A number of them are pro-death penalty.
That's correct. We have assembled a group, a death penalty committee that consists of individuals who are both for and against the death penalty. But a number of these individuals have decided to speak out in this case, believing that when it comes to the death penalty, there is no room for doubt. And one example is Judge Sessions, who was a former director of the FBI, Larry Thompson, who was the former Deputy Attorney General under the George W. Bush administration, Mark White, who was the former governor of Texas and oversaw 19 executions during his governorship.
And why are they calling for Davis's life to be spared?
I think that the sense among these people is that there's too much doubt too much doubt in this case. And regardless of whether one believes the death penalty is appropriate in some cases, it certainly is not appropriate in this particular case, with 7 of the 9 witnesses recanting, and also with the conviction generally resting upon eyewitness testimony. That in and of itself is problematic.
So if you had blood, you know, if you had fingerprints and weapons, you have a case of evidence. Eyewitness is perhaps the weakest form of determining whether someone is guilty or not. And so the lack of substantial evidence and his declaration of innocence and the recanting of witnesses is heavily suggestive.
Last week on MSNBC Politics Nation, Reverend Al Sharpton was joined by former Republican Congressmember Bob Barr, who's worked with the Constitution Project to oppose Davis's execution. Although Barr supports the death penalty in general, he said it should not be applied in Troy Davis's case.
There was no physical evidence. It's primarily based on eyewitness testimony under very difficult circumstances. It was nighttime. It was dark. It was a poorly lit parking lot. And you add on top of that the fact that these witnesses, many of these witnesses have, not just sort of cavalierly said that they were not sure or have recanted their testimony, but very, very credibly done. This case, if this execution goes forward, really is a textbook example of the sort of case in which the death penalty should not be applied.
And this is Brenda Forrest, one of the jurors in Troy's case. She told CNN she initially did not have any doubts that he committed the crime. However, Forrest has since changed her mind.
If I knew then what I know now, Troy Davis would not be on death row. The verdict would be not guilty.
Mary Mergler, how have jurors' reassessments factored into Troy's case?
Well, I think that it's more evidence of the fact that this this conviction is just pervaded with doubt. You have 4 jurors coming forward saying they have doubts, and that's because new evidence has arisen since the conviction, since the trial. The jurors were not able to hear these recantations, and they're now saying, had they heard them, that their decision likely would have been different.
And Mary Mergler, the role, as Reverend Jackson was talking about, of eyewitness testimony in these cases.
Well, what we know is that of the 3/4 of the 273 DNA exonerations that have taken place to date in this country, 3/4 of them have involved and been the conviction has been partly based upon eyewitness testimony. So we know that jurors put a lot of credibility in that testimony, and yet it is very often mistaken. Even eyewitnesses who testify in good faith are very often mistaken.
And it's also fair to say that in these cases, withheld information, often by prosecutors, politics and race are also factors in this matter. And I would hope that the 5 commissioners who may be listening to us, they will take the case. Don't be as Pontius Pilate was, and you can't find evidence the man is guilty, but just wash your hand and let a man die, and then you cannot recover a man who's dead after you've made a mistake. Don't risk the mistake. This is not just reasonable doubt. This is substantial doubt.
You met with the head of the Georgia board?
Met with the Georgia board to make a moral appeal to him. He would not say his vote for obvious reasons, but at least the board is considering. But 3 of the board members who are there now were not a part of this 20 years ago. So I would hope that the politics of the climate will be a factor in them making the final decision.
Does it have to be unanimous?
I think it's 3-2. And right now it seems to be 2-3 against Davis.
And you met with Troy Davis himself?
Met with Troy Davis, talked with him at length. So reasonable, so sound, so sane, such detail in his information, and walked into great detail where he was, where he was not, and who he thinks the suspects are. But none of the kind of evidence that we are not, as the witness suggests, as the jury suggests, none of the kind of evidence that we hear now was heard by that jury when they made this decision 20 years ago.
I want to thank you both for being with us. Reverend Jesse Jackson, founder of Rainbow Push, Mary Schmid-Mergler, Senior Counsel for the Constitution Project's Criminal Justice Program.